The Forbidden Love That Awakened Hell, a tragedy that continues to echo through the Appalachian Mountains decades later. In these misty peaks where isolation breeds secrets deeper than the hollers themselves. One family's story stands as a haunting testament to the consequences when bloodlines become tangled upon themselves. The year was 1952, and while most of America embraced the promise of post-war prosperity, the remote corners of eastern Kentucky remained virtually untouched by time. The Blackburn family had called these mountains home for 6 generations. Their cabin nestled deep in a secluded valley that outsiders rarely visited. They were known in the nearest town, some 15 miles away, as the Mountain Folk, a term that carried both respect for their self-sufficiency and whispered suspicion about their reclusive ways. Jacob Blackburn, the family patriarch, ruled his domain with unwavering authority, a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes and work-hardened hands. He'd inherited not just the family land but also the bitter mistrust of outsiders that had been passed down through generations. His wife Martha, once vivacious in her youth, had gradually faded into a silent shadow that moved obediently through their sparse cabin. "The outside world brings nothing but trouble," Jacob would proclaim during the rare occasions when the family ventured into town for supplies. "Everything we need is right here in these mountains." The Blackburn children, Elijah, Rebecca, Thomas, and Sarah, knew no life beyond the boundaries their father had established. Their education came not from schools, but from the harsh lessons of mountain survival, and the Bible passages Jacob recited by the firelight. The nearest school was simply too far to reach, a convenient truth that Jacob leveraged to keep his children isolated from outside influence. What townspeople didn't know was how the Blackburns' isolation had warped the natural order of things. As the children grew into adolescence, their social world remained limited to each other and the occasional interaction with distant cousins from an adjacent hollow. The absence of normal social connections created a dangerous vacuum where boundaries blurred and nature's taboos weakened. Rebecca, the eldest daughter, possessed a haunting beauty that seemed out of place in their hardscrabble existence. High cheekbones, unusual amber eyes, and a quiet grace that didn't come from her immediate lineage, but rather echoed back to her grandmother, a woman who had arrived from outside the mountains decades earlier. Her brother Elijah, 2 years her senior, had watched his sister's transformation from child to woman with an interest that transcended ordinary brotherly protection. In their isolated world where contact with outsiders was rare and discouraged, forbidden feelings began to take root. "You're different from anyone else in these mountains," Becky Elijah told her one autumn evening as they gathered kindling in the forest. "Pa says the outside world is full of wickedness. But I sometimes wonder if the real danger is what happens when folks stay too deep in these hills for too long." What began as confused affection between siblings evolved into something darker, a relationship that violated nature's most fundamental taboo. By the time Rebecca turned 17, she was carrying a secret that would eventually break their family apart and expose generations of hidden truths about the Blackburn lineage. Dr. William Harrison, the county's only physician, first encountered the Blackburns when Martha finally convinced Jacob that Sarah's persistent cough required medical attention. The doctor's trained eye noticed subtle signs that triggered his professional concern: the children's unusual facial features, the recurring health issues, and most troublingly, the way Rebecca protectively cradled her midsection when she thought no one was looking. "That family isn't right, doctor," Harrison confided to his wife that evening. "Something unnatural is happening up there, something that medicine alone can't fix." The doctor's suspicions were confirmed months later when Rebecca appeared at his office, her pregnancy undeniable. What followed was a reluctant confession that sent ripples of shock through the small community. The truth of her child's parentage exposed generations of intermarriage within the extended Blackburn clan, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and now the ultimate taboo between siblings. The local sheriff, bound by duty but hesitant to intervene in mountain affairs, finally rode up to the Blackburn cabin with Dr. Harrison and the county social worker in tow. What they discovered was a family system that had turned dangerously inward upon itself for decades. "In all my years wearing this badge," Sheriff Miller would later testify, "I have never seen a situation quite like what we found in that hollow. Those children were victims of isolation as much as anything else, cut off from the world, with no understanding of what was natural and what was forbidden." The revelation tore through the small community like wildfire, forcing longtime residents to confront uncomfortable truths about the isolation of their mountain neighborhoods and the secrets that could fester in such seclusion. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss a single episode of these hidden American histories that reveal the darkest corners of our nation's past, stories most historians are afraid to tell. The investigation into the Blackburn family revealed a disturbing pattern that stretched back generations. County records, dusty and incomplete as they were, suggested that the family's isolation hadn't been accidental but deliberate, a calculated withdrawal from society that began in the 1870s when Jeremiah Blackburn, Jacob's great-grandfather, led his extended family deep into the mountains following a violent dispute with authorities over land rights. What started as a temporary retreat became permanent seclusion. The Blackburns established their own small community, intermarrying with a handful of other families who shared their distrust of government and desire for independence. As decades passed, these families became increasingly interconnected, with marriage options limited to an ever-shrinking pool of potential partners. Dr. Harrison's examination of the family medical history revealed the devastating consequences of this isolation. The Blackburn children exhibited classic signs of genetic disorders, resulting from consanguinity, distinctive facial anomalies, developmental delays, and a pattern of recurring health issues that had been dismissed as mountain sickness but were actually the manifestations of recessive genetic conditions concentrated through generations of interbreeding. The human body contains warnings against this very thing, Dr. Harrison explained to the county judge. When closely related individuals have children together, harmful genetic traits that might otherwise remain dormant can emerge with devastating effects. Rebecca's pregnancy progressed with ominous difficulty. By her 7th month, complications forced her to remain at the county's small hospital under Dr. Harrison's watchful eye. Her child, a boy born 2 months premature, entered the world with multiple congenital abnormalities that confirmed the doctor's worst fears about the consequences of the family's interbreeding. The infant's conditions weren't just bad luck, the doctor noted in his medical journal. They were the inevitable result of generations of genetic compression, with the sibling relationship being the final, most destructive link in a chain that should never have been forged. The baby, named Joseph, survived against all medical expectations. However, his health challenges were profound. A heart condition, significant developmental delays, and physical characteristics that marked him unmistakably as a child of closely related parents. As the legal system struggled to address the Blackburn situation, social workers delved deeper into the family's history. They discovered journal entries from Martha Blackburn that revealed her own tragic story. She herself had been born of a union between first cousins and had been given to Jacob as a bride when she was just 15. Continuing a tradition of arranged marriages within an increasingly limited family network. "These mountains hold our stories," Martha had written in shaky handwriting. "Some are beautiful, but others should never be told. I pray my daughters find a path out that I never could." The journal also revealed Martha's growing concerns about Jacob's controlling behavior and his insistence on keeping the family isolated. She had recognized the unhealthy attachment forming between Elijah and Rebecca, but had been too fearful of her husband's reaction to intervene effectively. Elijah, when finally questioned by authorities, displayed a troubling lack of understanding about why his relationship with Rebecca was problematic, having been raised with minimal education and almost no exposure to societal norms. His moral compass had been shaped entirely by the isolated mountain community and his father's distorted teachings. "She's mine to protect," he insisted during questioning. "Pa always said family takes care of family and outsiders bring nothing but harm." Thomas and Sarah, the younger Blackburn children, revealed through careful interviews with child psychologists that the relationship between Elijah and Rebecca wasn't the only troubling dynamic in the family. They described a household where boundaries were blurred across generations, where family loyalty was invoked to justify controlling behavior, and where questions about their increasingly apparent health problems were dismissed as God's will. The extent of the family's isolation became even more apparent when investigators discovered that the children had never received vaccinations, had never attended school, and had almost no concept of life beyond their mountain hollow. Their worldview had been entirely shaped by Jacob's paranoid perspectives and the limited social interactions within their closed community. Local historian Evelyn Carter, who had been documenting Appalachian family histories for decades, provided crucial context. What happened with the Blackburns represents an extreme version of patterns that existed throughout isolated mountain communities. When geographic isolation combines with cultural isolation and poverty, the results can be devastating across generations. Carter's research revealed that the Blackburn case, while shocking, wasn't entirely unique. Throughout the Appalachian region, pockets of extreme isolation had created similar situations, though few as severe. These cases were rarely documented officially. protected by mountain codes of silence and the practical difficulties of accessing remote communities. The tragedy isn't just what happened, Carter explained, but that it could have been prevented if these communities hadn't been abandoned by the systems meant to protect all citizens. These weren't just mountain people living quaint, traditional lives. They were American citizens suffering in isolation while the rest of the country prospered. As autumn settled over the mountains in 1953, the Blackburn case had expanded beyond one family to expose systemic failures in how rural, isolated communities were served, or more accurately, not served, by education, healthcare, and social services. The romantic notion of independent mountain folk living by their own rules had obscured a darker reality of vulnerable families left to fend for themselves with devastating consequences. By 1954, the Blackburn case had drawn attention from medical researchers studying the effects of consanguinity. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University, traveled to Kentucky after reading Dr. Harrison's reports. What began as scientific curiosity evolved into a comprehensive study that would eventually help redefine understanding of genetic inheritance and the biological consequences of inbreeding. The Blackburn family presents a rare opportunity to document the cumulative effects of consanguineous relationships across multiple generations, Dr. Matthews wrote in her initial assessment. While ethically troubling, their situation provides invaluable data on recessive genetic disorders that might otherwise take decades to compile. With Martha Blackburn's reluctant permission, Dr. Matthews constructed a detailed family tree spanning 6 generations. The resulting document revealed a disturbing pattern as the family became increasingly isolated and intermarried. The incidence of birth defects, intellectual disabilities, and distinctive physical characteristics had risen dramatically. By the current generation, these traits had become so pronounced that the Blackburn children were immediately recognizable as products of a genetically compressed lineage. Young Joseph, Rebecca's son, became the focal point of Dr. Matthews' research. Now a toddler, his development lagged significantly behind typical milestones. His distinctive facial features, widely spaced eyes, low-set ears, and an unusually small jaw were consistent with known genetic syndromes resulting from parental consanguinity. When closely related individuals have children together, Dr. Matthews explained to a gathering of medical students who had traveled to observe her research. Recessive genetic traits that might otherwise remain dormant have a much higher chance of expression. It's nature's warning system, telling us that genetic diversity is essential for healthy offspring. What truly moved me during my investigation into this case was witnessing Rebecca's transformation. Once removed from her father's control and placed in a supportive environment, she began to understand the magnitude of what had happened to her family. Her journey from victim to advocate became one of the few hopeful threads in this otherwise tragic tapestry. I never knew there was anything wrong with how we lived, Rebecca confided during a recorded interview in 1955. When you're raised in that kind of isolation, the abnormal becomes normal. Now I understand that what happened to us wasn't just bad luck or God's will, it was the result of choices made by our ancestors and continued by my father. I believe our viewers would want me to know their thoughts on this heartbreaking situation. If you feel this family was failed by society, type society failed them in the comments below. Your voice matters in acknowledging these hidden American tragedies. Jacob Blackburn, meanwhile, remained unrepentant from the jail cell, where he awaited trial on charges of child endangerment and failure to provide education and medical care. He continued to insist that his family's way of life was justified. The government has no right to tell a man how to raise his family, he told reporters during a rare interview. These mountains were our protection from a corrupt world. Now they've taken my children and destroyed everything my ancestors built. The legal proceedings against Jacob revealed the challenges of applying standard laws to such an unusual case. While neglect and endangerment were clear, prosecutors struggled with how to address the consanguineous relationships. Existing laws hadn't anticipated a situation where isolation and ignorance had so thoroughly distorted family boundaries. This case exists in a gray area of our legal system, District Attorney Frank Reynolds acknowledged. We're dealing with actions that are unquestionably harmful, but were perpetuated through generations of isolation rather than deliberate malice. The question becomes, how do we achieve justice while recognizing that the perpetrators were, in many ways, also victims? The most profound impact of the case came through its influence on public policy. The The Blackburn situation exposed critical gaps in rural outreach for healthcare, education, and social services. State legislators, confronted with the consequences of neglecting isolated communities, implemented new requirements for tracking school-age children and ensuring regular medical visits even in the most remote areas. By 1956, these policy changes had led to the identification of several other isolated family groups with similar patterns of consanguinity, though none as extreme as the Blackburns. Intervention in these cases prevented further generational damage, with children receiving necessary medical care and education while families received support rather than mere judgment. Elijah Blackburn's story took a different turn. Deemed unfit to stand trial due to his limited understanding of societal norms and diagnosed with several cognitive disabilities, likely resulting from his family's inbreeding, he was committed to a state psychiatric facility. There, separated from the mountains that had defined his existence, he gradually began to comprehend the magnitude of his family's tragedy. "I didn't know," he repeated during therapy sessions. "How could I know what nobody ever taught me?" Martha Blackburn, once freed from Jacob's control, revealed the extent of her own victimization. Married as a teenager to a much older cousin, she had spent her life confined by mountain traditions that treated women as property. Her quiet rebellion had come through her journal and her subtle efforts to protect her children from the worst of Jacob's control. "I should have done more," she told social workers. "But when all you've ever known is submission, finding your voice feels impossible." The younger Blackburn children, Thomas and Sarah, showed remarkable resilience once placed in foster care. Though both struggled with health issues and developmental delays resulting from their genetic inheritance, they adapted to their new environments with determination. Their progress offered hope that the cycle, while devastating, could be broken. As Dr. Matthews concluded in her groundbreaking 1957 paper on the Blackburn case, "What we observe in this family is not merely a medical curiosity but a profound human tragedy that spans generations. The biological consequences of consanguinity manifest not just in physical and cognitive differences but in the perpetuation of isolation that allows such practices to continue. Breaking this cycle requires not just medical intervention but social and educational outreach to the most isolated corners of our society." The scientific implications of the Blackburn case extended far beyond their hollow in the Appalachian Mountains. By 1958, Dr. Matthews' research had gained international attention, contributing significantly to the emerging field of genetic counseling. Medical journals published her findings, carefully anonymizing the family while preserving the crucial data their tragic situation had provided. "What makes the Mountain family case so significant, Doctor?" Matthews explained during a presentation at a medical conference in Boston, "is that it demonstrates the cumulative effect of consanguinity across multiple generations. Most documented cases involve single instances of cousin marriages. But this family represents an extreme case where the genetic pool became increasingly compressed over nearly a century." The medical examination of Martha Blackburn and her children revealed conditions that had previously been documented individually but rarely seen clustered. Within a single family, heart defects, distinctive facial characteristics, intellectual disabilities, metabolic disorders, and a heightened susceptibility to certain diseases. The combination created a distinctive pattern that researchers began referring to as Appalachian family syndrome, though later scientific ethics would discourage such geographic stigmatization. Joseph, now 6 years old in 1959, embodied the most severe manifestations of these conditions. Despite receiving the best medical care available, his development remained significantly delayed. He never developed speech beyond a few words and required constant care for his multiple health conditions. Yet those who worked with him noted his gentle nature and responsiveness to music, a reminder of the humanity that existed behind the medical case study. "We must be careful not to view these individuals solely through the lens of their genetic conditions," Dr. Harrison cautioned in a letter to his colleagues. "Each person in this family is a complete human being with their own dignity, despite the circumstances of their birth. Our scientific interests must never overshadow our humanitarian responsibilities." The social ramifications of the case proved equally significant. As news of the mountain inbreeding spread, public reaction revealed deep-seated prejudices about Appalachian communities. National newspapers published sensationalized accounts that reinforced negative stereotypes about hillbillies and mountain folk, often ignoring the complex social and historical factors that had contributed to the isolation of such communities. Sociologist Dr. James Bennett from the University of Kentucky pushed back against this narrative, documenting how economic factors, historical distrust of authorities stemming from exploitative coal and timber practices, and geographic isolation had created the conditions where such family structures could develop and persist. What happened with the Blackburns represents an extreme outcome of systemic abandonment, Dr. Bennett wrote. When communities are denied access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunity for generations, they develop alternative social structures that may include practices the wider society considers taboo. The appropriate response is not disgust, but recognition of our collective failure to include these Americans in our nation's progress. By 1960, the Blackburn case had influenced policy changes throughout the Appalachian region. Mobile medical clinics began reaching previously underserved mountain communities. Educational outreach programs were established to identify children not attending school. Social workers received specialized training in approaching isolated families with respect rather than judgment. For the Blackburn children, these systemic changes came too late to prevent the damage done, but their story directly contributed to protecting other vulnerable children. Rebecca, now in her mid-20s and living in a supported housing program with her son, became an unlikely advocate for rural healthcare access. Though she struggled with the psychological aftermath of her family history, she found purpose in ensuring others wouldn't face the same isolation. "I didn't choose to be born into my family," Rebecca told a journalist in a rare interview. "None of us choose our beginnings, but I can choose to use my story to help others understand why no community should be forgotten or left behind." The genetic legacy of the Blackburns continued to inform medical research throughout the 1960s. As genetic science advanced, researchers identified specific recessive gene mutations that had been concentrated through the family's intermarriage. These findings contributed to the development of genetic counseling protocols that are still used today. By 1965, Joseph's health had deteriorated significantly. Complications from his congenital heart condition, compounded by a respiratory infection, claimed his life at the age of 12. His passing represented both a personal tragedy for Rebecca and the culmination of generations of isolation and intermarriage. Medical researchers, with Rebecca's permission, conducted a thorough genetic analysis that provided invaluable data on the specific mechanisms through which consanguinity had affected his development. Joseph's life, though brief, has contributed significantly to our understanding of genetic inheritance, Dr. Matthews noted in her final report on the case. His medical legacy will help prevent similar suffering for countless future children. Martha Blackburn, who had found some measure of peace working as a housekeeper for a kind family in a neighboring county, reflected on her family's journey during a recorded oral history project in 1967. "These mountains hold both beauty and danger," she said, gazing toward the ridges that had once been her prison. "I don't blame the land for what happened to us. I blame the walls we built. Not just the physical ones, but the ones in our minds that kept us apart from the wider world." Jacob Blackburn died in prison in 1968, still insisting that the outside world had destroyed his family rather than saved them from practices that had doomed his children to suffering. His unrepentant stance highlighted how thoroughly isolation can distort perception, creating alternate moral universes where harmful practices become normalized and defended. The younger Blackburn children, Thomas and Sarah, found different paths forward. Thomas, despite his learning difficulties, developed skills as a carpenter and eventually established a modest but independent life. Sarah, whose health issues were less severe, completed a high school education and married, choosing to live far from the mountains that held such difficult memories. Nearly 3 decades after the Blackburn case first came to light, I returned to the hollow where their cabin had once stood. By 1980, the physical traces of their presence had almost entirely vanished. Nature had reclaimed the clearing, with young trees pushing up through the rotted remnants of the cabin's foundation. Only a collapsed stone chimney remained as evidence that a family had once made this remote spot their home. Yet the echoes of their story continued to resonate, both in the local community and in the broader understanding of genetic science and rural healthcare policy. The Blackburn case, though largely forgotten by the general public, had left an indelible mark on how medicine approaches the rare but persistent issue of consanguinity in isolated communities. Dr. William Harrison, now in his 70s and retired from medical practice, agreed to revisit the site with me. As we made the difficult trek up the overgrown path, he reflected on how the case had transformed his understanding of rural healthcare. "Before the Blackburns, I thought my responsibility ended at treating whatever ailments walked through my door," he admitted. "Afterward, I realized that true healthcare means reaching out to those who don't or can't seek help on their own. Some of the most vulnerable never make it to a doctor's office." The policy changes sparked by the Blackburn case had proven remarkably effective. Educational outreach programs had identified and integrated previously isolated children into school systems. Mobile medical clinics had established regular schedules serving remote communities. Social workers had developed culturally sensitive approaches to providing services without judgment. These interventions had significantly reduced instances of consanguinity in the region, though occasional cases still emerged in the most isolated pockets. When they did, the response was no longer sensationalism and moral outrage, but compassionate intervention focused on protecting children while preserving family dignity whenever possible. Rebecca Blackburn's life had taken an unexpected turn by the late 1970s. Following Joseph's death, she had channeled her grief into education, eventually earning a GED and then training as a community health worker. By the time of my visit, she was working with a rural outreach program, using her unique perspective to help bridge the gap between medical professionals and isolated mountain families. "I can speak both languages," she explained during our interview at her modest home in a small town some 50 miles from her childhood hollow. "I understand the fear and mistrust these families feel toward outsiders, but I also understand what isolation can cost them. When I knock on a cabin door, they see someone who knows their ways, not just another government official." Now in her mid-40s, Rebecca showed few physical signs of her family's genetic history, just the distinctive amber eyes that had been passed down from her grandmother. The most significant inheritance she carried was an intimate understanding of how isolation can warp perception and how difficult it can be to recognize harmful patterns when they're all you've ever known. "I don't blame my parents the way I once did," she reflected. "They were products of their own upbringing, trapped in patterns established generations before they were born. What happened wasn't evil in the way outsiders imagined. It was the result of ignorance perpetuated by isolation." The scientific legacy of the Blackburn case continued to inform genetics research. By the 1980s, advancements in genetic testing had made it possible to identify carriers of recessive disorders before conception, allowing for informed family planning. The specific genetic markers identified in the Blackburn lineage had contributed significantly to this progress. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, whose career had been largely defined by her work with the family, published a comprehensive 30-year follow-up study that tracked the health outcomes of all surviving Blackburns. Her findings confirmed the gradual dilution of genetic issues once family members integrated into the wider population and formed relationships outside their compressed genetic pool. "Nature favors diversity," Dr. Matthews concluded in her final paper before retirement. The Blackburn case demonstrates both the consequences when that principle is violated and the remarkable resilience that emerges when it's restored. Elijah Blackburn, who had spent decades in institutional care, passed away in 1979. His medical records revealed how psychiatric treatment had gradually helped him understand the nature of his family's situation. In his final years, he had achieved a degree of peace, even corresponding occasionally with Rebecca and expressing regret for patterns he had perpetuated without comprehending their harm. Thomas and Sarah, the younger siblings who had been removed from the family as children, had maintained contact with each other but chosen different relationships with their past. Thomas had embraced a fresh start, rarely speaking of his childhood and establishing a new identity removed from the Blackburn history. Sarah had taken a more integrative approach, working through her experiences in therapy and eventually reaching a place where she could acknowledge her past without being defined by it. The most poignant aspect of my investigation came when local historians shared with me a collection of letters Jacob Blackburn's grandfather had written in the 1870s, discovered in a county historical archive. These documents revealed that the family's retreat into isolation had begun not as a rejection of society's values, but as a response to exploitation and discrimination. What started as a temporary withdrawal for self-protection had, over generations, evolved into a harmful separation that ultimately damaged the very family it was meant to preserve. If you've watched until this point, you clearly appreciate these deep dives into America's hidden histories. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can know who truly values these stories from our nation's shadows. Subscribe to our channel for more untold American histories. Hit the like button if you found this story educational, and share it with others who appreciate learning about the complex realities of our past. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light, ensuring that even the most isolated corners of American history aren't forgotten. The Blackburn story ultimately isn't simply about the consequences of consanguinity. It's about the dangers of extreme isolation, the importance of inclusive social systems, and the delicate balance between respecting cultural differences and protecting vulnerable individuals. It's a reminder that no community should exist beyond the reach of education, healthcare, and child protection, not because outside ways are inherently superior, but because isolation itself can become a prison that traps generations in harmful patterns they lack the context to recognize. As Dr. Harrison and I made our way back down from the hollow, the setting sun cast long shadows through the trees. The mountains held their beauty and their secrets, as they always had. But thanks to the lessons learned from the Blackburn tragedy, fewer families remained hidden in those remote valleys, suffering in isolation. Their story, though painful, had ultimately brought light to places long shrouded in darkness.